A 13-foot wooden dinghy is drifting somewhere in the South Atlantic, 1,600 miles from the nearest coastline, and inside it, 4 men are deciding which one of them is going to be eaten. 3 of them are grown sailors. The 4th is a 17-year-old boy named Richard Parker, and he is lying in the bottom of the boat, barely conscious, having made the mistake a few days earlier of drinking seawater to quiet a thirst that would not be quieted. His lips are black. His body is shutting down. The captain, a man named Tom Dudley, has already worked out the arithmetic in his head, and the arithmetic does not favor the boy. The other 2 have families waiting in England. The boy has no one. And so, on the morning the decision is finally acted on, Dudley says a short prayer, leans over the body, tells the boy that his time has come, and pushes a penknife into the side of his neck. That happened in 1884, not in some distant half-legendary past, but in the same decade that gave us the telephone, the skyscraper, and the safety bicycle. Queen Victoria was on the throne, and these were not strangers to civilization. They were British sailors who fully expected when they got home that everyone would understand exactly why they'd done what they did. Welcome in. Glad you found the channel. Do me a small favor while you're getting comfortable. Drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're listening from. I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel, and it's become one of my favorite parts of doing this. A drink, blanket, whatever gets you through a long one, go grab it now, because this is going to be a long sit, and some of it is genuinely hard to hear. I'll try to be steady about it. The history deserves that much. Let me take you back to where the boy's story really starts, because the Mignonette didn't set out to become one of the most famous legal cases in the English-speaking world. It set out to be a delivery job. The Mignonette was a yacht, a small one, 52 feet, built for racing and gentle coastal sailing, the sort of pretty little vessel a wealthy man keeps for pleasure rather than for crossing oceans. An Australian lawyer named John Henry Want had bought her, and he wanted her brought out to Sydney, which meant somebody had to sail this fragile thing all the way around the bottom of Africa and across the Indian Ocean. Tom Dudley took the job as captain. He was 31, experienced, by most accounts a decent and capable man, and he assembled a crew of 3. Edwin Stevens as mate, a man in his mid-30s, Edmund Brooks, an able seaman everyone called Ned, and the boy, Richard Parker, who'd signed on as cabin boy and general hand. Parker was from a poor family near Southampton. This was his first proper voyage of any length. He was, by the standards of the time, almost a man, but only almost. They left Southampton on the 19th of May, 1884. For the first few weeks, nothing unusual. The little yacht behaved as well as a little yacht can in open water. The men settled into the rhythm of a long passage, and the boy did what cabin boys do, which is everything nobody else wants to do. They crossed the equator. They pushed down into the South Atlantic, into the latitudes where the weather turns serious, and the swells start coming from a long way off with real weight behind them. It's worth sitting for a moment on how badly suited the Mignonette was for any of this, because it shapes everything that comes after. A vessel like her was built for the Solent on a summer afternoon, for gentlemen in caps to race each other within sight of land, and then come in for dinner. Sailing her around the Cape of Good Hope was a bit like driving a delicate little carriage across open desert, possible in theory, with luck and care, and a poor idea in practice. Dudley knew it. He'd raised doubts about her seaworthiness before they left, but the job paid, and the owner wanted his yacht in Sydney, and so the four of them set off into thousands of miles of ocean in a boat that had no real business being out there. Jack Want, the man who'd bought her, stayed comfortably in England, his name destined to appear in none of the horror that followed. The boy himself we know less about than we'd like, which is the usual fate of the poor in these records. The wealthy leave letters and portraits. The cabin boys leave a name on a crew list and not much else. Richard Parker was around 17, from Itchen Ferry, a little fishing settlement near Southampton, one of those places where nearly everyone went to sea because there wasn't much other work to be had. He'd taken the job, by most accounts, out of a young man's hunger to see the world, to come back from a long voyage able to call himself a proper sailor. He was the youngest aboard by a wide margin and the least experienced by a wider one. The others were grown men with grown men's lives behind them. He was a teenager on his first real adventure, and the small, awful thing that hangs over the whole story is that he had been looking forward to it. On the 5th of July, well out into the ocean, a wave caught her. Not a freak 100-foot monster out of a film, just a heavy following sea. The kind that finds the weakness in a hull that was never meant to be there in the first place. Dudley later described seeing the wave come and knowing, in the way sailors know things, that it was going to do damage. It stove in the side of the yacht. Water came in faster than anyone could do anything about, and within about 5 minutes, the Mignonette was gone, slipping down into water more than a mile deep. They got the dinghy over the side just in time. 13 feet of thin wooden boards, a 1/4 inch thick, the sort of boat you'd use to row from a ship to a dock and back. Into that they tumbled, 4 men, and as the yacht went down, Dudley managed to grab a few things. Navigational instruments, a chronometer, and almost nothing else. No fresh water. In the scramble, somebody had thrown 2 tins of turnips into the boat. That was the entire food supply for 4 men in the middle of the Atlantic. 2 tins of turnips and whatever the sea decided to give them. Stop and think about the actual object they were now living in. 13 feet, end to end. 4 grown bodies in it, plus oars, plus whatever they'd saved. Barely room to lie down, no shelter from the sun by day or the cold by night. And the freeboard, the height of the side above the water, was a matter of inches. Every swell that rolled under them lifted the whole world up and dropped it again. They had to bail constantly. The boards were so thin that Dudley worried the boat would simply break apart in any real weather. And around them, in every direction, was the South Atlantic, which is not a forgiving stretch of ocean even for a proper ship. The nearest land was over 1,000 miles off. The shipping lanes were elsewhere. They were, in the most literal sense, 4 men and a wooden box on top of more than a mile of cold water. The first night, a shark came. They beat at it with the oars in the dark, this enormous shape bumping the underside of a boat you could nearly span with your arms, and somehow they kept it off. You get a sense, very quickly, of how thin the margin was. a few boards between them and water that went down forever, and things living in that water that were extremely interested in the 4 warm bodies bobbing on the surface. Dudley said afterward that the shark came back more than once over the following days, circling, and that they came to dread the sight of the fin almost as much as the thirst. They made the first tin of turnips last 2 days. On the 4th day they caught a turtle, which sounds like a stroke of luck, and was, but a single turtle does not go very far among 4 starving men, and it had to be made to last. They ate what they could of it over the following days, including parts you would never choose to eat under any other circumstances, the offal, the soft tissue, scraping the shell, and they tried to catch the blood and any rainwater in the empty turnip tins. The 2nd tin of turnips had been spoiled by seawater and was useless. They tried to fish and caught nothing. By around the 12th or 13th of July, they had nothing left to eat at all, and worse, nothing to drink, and no rain had fallen to give them any. The thirst is what breaks men first. You can last a surprisingly long time without food. The body has reserves. It burns its own fat and then its own muscle. It holds on. Water runs on a far shorter clock, a matter of days, and out on the open ocean you are surrounded on every side by the one substance you absolutely must not drink, which is its own particular cruelty. Mile after mile of water in every direction, and not a drop of it any use to a dying man. They drank their own urine. Dudley was honest about this later, in court, in front of a room full of people in proper Victorian dress, describing how they'd saved it in the tins and drunk it because there was nothing else. And the boy, Richard Parker, did the thing that everyone aboard knew not to do. He drank seawater. Maybe the thirst overrode his judgment. Maybe nobody could stop him. The salt in seawater pulls water out of your body faster than it gives any back, so drinking it when you're already dehydrated speeds you toward death and brings on a kind of delirium along the way. Parker got sick almost immediately. He lay down in the bottom of the boat and began to slip away from the others, into fever and then into something deeper. What dehydration does to a body over days is its own slow horror, and it helps to understand it, to grasp the state these men were in. Your blood thickens. Your tongue swells until it fills your mouth and cracks. Speaking becomes painful, then nearly impossible. Your eyes sink. The skin loses its elasticity, so a pinch of it stays standing up in a ridge instead of falling back. The mind goes strange, first irritable, then confused, then prone to seeing and hearing things that aren't there. By the 2nd week, the 4 of them were somewhere along that road, sunburned raw, their lips split, their bodies eating themselves from the inside for want of anything to drink. The horror of being surrounded by water you cannot touch is a particular kind of torment, and sailors throughout history have described it as a slow madness. The boy, having poisoned himself with the seawater on top of all that, was simply further along the road than the others. Now I want to be straight with you about what happened next, because the temptation with a story like this is to soften it, and it doesn't deserve softening. By around the 20th of July, these men had been adrift for over 2 weeks. They were skeletal, their skin was cracking and weeping. Dudley, as captain, started raising the idea that had been hanging unspoken in the boat for days, that one of them would have to die so the others could live, and that the fair way to choose was to draw lots. This was not a wild idea he'd invented in his delirium. It was a known thing among sailors, an old and grim tradition with a name. And I'll come back to that name shortly, because it matters more than you'd think. Brooks refused to draw lots. He wanted no part of it, so no lots were drawn. And without lots, the choice defaulted to the most obvious and most defenseless option, the one Dudley had probably settled on privately already. The boy was dying anyway. The boy had no wife, no children, nobody depending on his wages. The men talked about it in front of Parker or near Parker, though by this point he was drifting in and out and may not have understood much. On the morning of the 25th of July, Dudley decided it was time. He and Stevens agreed. Brooks later said he took no part, though he did in the end eat. Dudley made a kind of prayer, asking forgiveness, asking God to understand the position they were in, and then he went to the boy. By the most repeated account, Parker was barely conscious, drifting at the bottom of the boat, and may have managed a single weak word, possibly what, possibly nothing at all. Stevens held the boy's legs. Dudley took the penknife, the small folding knife a sailor carries for ordinary work, for rope and rigging, and pushed it into the jugular vein at the side of the boy's neck, the big vein that carries the blood back from the head. And they had the tins ready, because they were dying of thirst, and the blood that came was warm and wet, and it was the only liquid for 1,000 miles. For 4 days, 3 grown men lived on the body of a 17-year-old. I'm not going to linger over the mechanics longer than I have to, but you should understand the plain reality of it, because the law and the public eventually had to. They drank the blood first, while it was fresh. Then they ate. The liver and the heart went first, because the organs spoil fastest, and because a starving body craves exactly that. They cut strips of flesh from the body and ate them raw, since they had no fire and no way to make one in an open boat. Dudley, when he finally described it in a courtroom full of people in stiff collars and good coats, did it in a flat, worn voice that unsettled everyone who heard it, not because he was boasting or relishing it, but because by the time he spoke the words he had clearly lived through them in his mind 10,000 times, and the horror had been rubbed smooth by repetition into something he could simply recite. On the 29th of July, 4 days after the killing, a sail appeared. A German bark called the Montezuma, bound for Hamburg, spotted the dinghy and came about. The 3 men were hauled aboard, barely alive, surrounded by the remains of what they had been eating. The German crew did not need it explained to them. Sailors knew. They cleaned the men up, fed them carefully so their starved bodies wouldn't reject the food, and brought them back toward England. The boat reached Falmouth on the 6th of September. The rescue itself is worth a beat because of how close it ran. 4 days. If the Montezuma had passed by 4 days earlier, the boy would very likely have died on his own of the seawater poisoning, and the others might or might not have survived the wait, and there would have been no killing to put on trial. If she'd passed 4 days later than she did, all 3 survivors would almost certainly have been dead. The entire legal landmark, the case every law student learns, the whole question of whether necessity can excuse murder, turns on a German cargo ship happening across 13 feet of drifting wood at one precise point in a vast ocean. The men, when they saw the sail, reportedly couldn't even stand to wave. They were down to skin over bone, unable to do much more than lie in the bottom of the boat and hope the lookout on the bark had sharp eyes. And here is where the story turns from a horror at sea into something stranger, because the men did not hide what they'd done. They reported it. They walked into the customs house at Falmouth and gave a full and frank account, including the killing of the boy, because they genuinely believed they were protected. They believed in the old tradition with their whole hearts. They believed that any sailor, any judge, any reasonable Englishman would hear what had happened and understand at once that the sea keeps its own laws, and that when 4 men are starving in a boat 1,000 miles from land, the death of 1 to save 3 is simply how it has always been done and always would be. They were so certain of it that they kept the boy's remaining effects, made no attempt to dispose of the evidence, and told the story plainly to officials. It did not cross their minds that they were confessing to a crime. Let me pause on that tradition because it's the thing that makes this whole grim corner of history hang together, and once you understand it, you'll see it everywhere. Sailors called it the custom of the sea. It wasn't written in any law book. It was passed mouth to mouth across generations of men who knew, in the backs of their minds, that the ocean might one day put them in an open boat with nothing to eat but each other. The custom said roughly this: if a man dies naturally, the others may eat him to survive. And if no one has died yet, and death is coming for all of them anyway, they may draw lots, a fair lottery, to choose who dies so the rest can live. The man who drew the fatal lot was supposed to accept it without struggle as his share of the common bad luck. Often a second lot was drawn to decide who would do the killing, so that no single person bore the full weight of it, and the killing was usually done by opening a vein or cutting the throat, partly for speed and partly so the others could drink the blood while it was fresh, since thirst tended to be the thing that killed first. It sounds almost orderly when you lay it out like that. A terrible system, but a system, with rules and fairness and a kind of grim courtesy built into it. The reality was a good deal uglier, and the historians who've gone through the actual cases, a legal scholar named Brian Simpson wrote the definitive study of all this, found that the lotteries were very often rigged or quietly skipped or arranged so that the outcome was settled before a single lot was ever drawn. And the people who ended up dead were not a random cross-section of the crew. They were the boys. They were the foreigners. The men who didn't speak the language well enough to argue about how the draw had been run. They were the black sailors, and on some ships, the enslaved men carried aboard as cargo or labor. The custom of the sea had rules, but the rules bent every single time in the direction of whoever had the least power in the boat. Richard Parker fit that pattern exactly. The youngest, the weakest, the only one with no wife and no children and no family to come asking hard questions afterward. The custom didn't choose him. The men did, and the custom gave them the words to feel better about it. You can follow this back through case after case, and they get under your skin in different ways. Decades before the Mignonette, in 1765, An American ship called the Peggy was adrift in the Atlantic for months. The crew reduced to eating the leather off the rigging, and the buttons off their coats boiled into a kind of broth. When that ran out, they came to the captain, a man named Harrison who was sick in his cabin, and told him they'd drawn lots. The lot, they said, had fallen on an enslaved black man aboard. Harrison suspected, almost certainly correctly, that there had been no real lottery at all, that the men had simply chosen the one person aboard they considered least human and dressed the murder up in the language of fairness. They shot him, they ate him, and because the rest of the crew survived to tell it, no one was ever punished. That's the shape of it again and again, the lottery as a kind of theatre, a ritual that let frightened men tell themselves they'd followed the rules while doing exactly what they were always going to do. The Frances Spate gives you the pattern in its rawest form. She was an Irish ship out of Limerick, and in December of 1835, on a return crossing from Canada, she capsized in a storm in the North Atlantic. 3 men drowned at once. The rest survived clinging to the waterlogged, dismasted hull, with no provisions reachable and the sea washing over them. After about 2 weeks, the captain, a man named Gorman, decided lots had to be drawn, but he decided the lots would be drawn only among the 4 apprentice boys aboard, on the reasoning that the boys had no wives and no children depending on them. The grown men, the married men, were exempt from the start. So it wasn't really a lottery for the whole crew at all. It was a lottery to decide which of the 4 most powerless people on the wreck would die. A 15-year-old named Patrick O'Brien, an orphan, a workhouse apprentice, drew the fatal lot. The cook was supposed to do the killing and refused, couldn't bring himself to do it. O'Brien was given a chance to open his own veins and tried, with a piece of glass or a blade, and couldn't manage that either, his hands too weak and too frightened. In the end, his throat was cut. More of the boys died and were eaten before a passing ship, the Angerona, finally took the survivors off. And when the survivors got home, they weren't prosecuted, they were pitied. The public read it as a tragedy that had happened to them, not a crime they had committed. A generation later, in 1874, almost on the eve of the Mignonette case, a British ship called the Euxine burned and sank in the South Atlantic, and one of her lifeboats drifted with a starving crew until they too turned to lots. The lifeboat drew lots 3 separate times, and each time somehow the lot fell on the same man, a young Italian sailor who barely spoke English, the obvious outsider in a boat full of British seamen. 3 lotteries, 3 losses, for the one man least able to argue about how the draw was conducted. He was killed and eaten, and the grim irony is that rescue came only hours later. The men involved were brought back, and the authorities looked at prosecuting the officer who'd organized it, and in the end let it slide, partly because nobody had the appetite to hang shipwreck survivors. That hesitation, that long history of letting it slide, was exactly the thing the judges in the Mignonette case had in their minds when they decided that this time the custom of the sea would finally meet the inside of a courtroom. A few years before Victoria came to the throne, there was a case that became a kind of Bible for sailors thinking about the unthinkable, and it gave the world Moby Dick into the bargain. In November of 1820, an American whale ship called the Essex, out of Nantucket, was working the Pacific far out near the equator when an enormous sperm whale, Survivors put it at 85 feet, bigger than the ship herself, turned and rammed her, deliberately, twice. The second blow stove in the bow and the Essex went down, leaving 20 men in 3 small whaleboats 2,000 miles from the nearest reliable land. They had a choice of routes. The closer islands lay to the west, but the crew had heard those islands were full of cannibals, and so, terrified of being eaten, they chose to sail the far longer route east toward South America. The bitter joke at the heart of the Essex story is that their fear of cannibals is exactly what doomed them to become cannibals themselves. Because the eastward voyage was thousands of miles and the food gave out long before they reached help. The men began to die of starvation and exposure, and as they died, the survivors ate them. At first, only those who died naturally. Then, in the boat captained by George Pollard, when even that ran out and death was coming for all of them, they did the old thing. They drew lots. The lot fell on a young man named Owen Coffin, who happened to be Pollard's own first cousin, a teenager the captain had personally promised to look after. Pollard, by the account that came down, offered to take the boy's place, told him he didn't have to accept it, said he'd shoot the first man who laid a hand on him, and Coffin refused the rescue. He said the lot was fair and he'd take what was his. A second lot chose the executioner. It fell on Charles Ramsdell, the boy's close friend, and Ramsdell shot him. And they ate him, the captain eating his own cousin to stay alive. When a rescue ship finally found Pollard's boat, the 2 survivors aboard were so far gone they didn't even register being saved at first. They were found at the bottom of the boat sucking the marrow from the bones of their dead shipmates, and they reportedly clutched those bones and didn't want to give them up. 8 of the original 20 lived. The first mate, Owen Chase, wrote it all down, and a young Herman Melville later read that account and built a novel around the idea of a whale that fights back. People remember the whale. They tend to forget the boats afterward. There's a wreck from 1816 I have to tell you about, even though it's French and just barely before Victoria's reign, because it became the single image of this whole nightmare for the entire 19th century. A French naval frigate called the Medusa, ran aground off the coast of West Africa. She'd been handed to a captain who hadn't sailed in some 20 years, an aristocrat given the command as a political favor, and he drove her straight onto a sandbank that a competent navigator would have avoided. The ship carried nowhere near enough lifeboats for everyone aboard, so the crew lashed together an enormous, clumsy raft, around 65 feet long, and crowded roughly 147 people onto it. The plan was for the lifeboats to tow the raft to shore. The lifeboats cut the ropes. The officers in the boats, realizing the raft was dragging them down and that they could save themselves if they abandoned everyone, simply cut the tow lines and rowed away, leaving 147 people on a platform that floated barely above the waterline, with almost no food and a few casks of wine. What happened on that raft over the next 13 days is one of the worst things I know of. The first night, in the dark, men were swept off the edges or sucked under where the raft sagged below the surface. Fights broke out over the few safe spots in the center. People drank the wine and lost their minds on it. A mutiny broke out, then another, and men killed each other with sabers and bare hands. By the second or third day, the survivors were eating the dead. They cut strips of flesh from the corpses and laid them out on the wooden planks to dry in the sun, because slightly dried human flesh was marginally easier to swallow than raw. When the rescue ship finally found the raft after 13 days, 15 people were still alive out of nearly 150, and the officers who climbed aboard to save them described ropes and pieces of the structure draped with human meat, hung out to cure like fish on a line. 5 of those 15 died shortly after being brought ashore, too far gone to be saved. The painter Théodore Géricault made an enormous canvas of the scene a few years later, a wall-sized painting that hangs in the Louvre to this day, and he researched it obsessively, interviewing survivors, studying real corpses in a morgue to get the color and slack of dead flesh exactly right. People file past it now as a great work of art, admiring the composition and the light, mostly without registering that every grotesque detail in it was drawn from the testimony of men who had actually been on that raft, and that the bodies he painted so carefully were studied from the genuinely dead. I bring up the Medusa because it sets the stage for what the Victorians inherited. By the time the Mignonette went down in 1884, generations of these stories already saturated the culture. Sailors knew them by heart and traded them on long watches. Lawyers knew them. The reading public devoured them in the penny papers, the more gruesome the better. Everyone understood, at some level they didn't much examine, that the sea occasionally turned ordinary men into this, and there was a quiet, unspoken agreement running underneath it all, that you didn't judge a starving man too harshly for what he did in an open boat 1,000 miles from help. The custom of the sea wasn't just a practice among sailors, it was something close to a shared belief across the whole seafaring nation, a grim allowance the public was prepared to make, right up until the moment the law decided it would no longer make it. Which is exactly why the 3 men of the Mignonette were so stunned by what happened to them. Because the law decided, this time, to make an example. The Home Secretary, a man named Harcourt, looked at the case and decided that the custom of the sea was not going to be quietly waved through one more time. A police sergeant at Falmouth had already taken the penknife into evidence. Dudley and Stevens were arrested and charged with murder. Brooks was not charged. He became a witness for the prosecution instead, which tells you something about how these things get carved up. The trial opened at Exeter in November of 1884, and it became a sensation, partly because the defendants were so obviously not villains. They were respectable, exhausted, broken men who had done a monstrous thing and could not understand why everyone was treating it as a crime. The mood in the country was strange and divided. Plenty of ordinary people, and especially the sailing communities along the coast, were openly on the side of the accused. Money was raised by public subscription to help pay for their defense. Sailors saw 2 of their own being prosecuted for the oldest, most understood survival custom in their trade, and they were genuinely angry about it. The men themselves seemed to have walked into court half expecting sympathy, because they had been so transparent about everything. They'd never tried to hide the killing, never disposed of the evidence, never lied. Dudley in particular gave his testimony in a plain, matter-of-fact way that some found chilling and others found simply honest. He described the prayer, the knife, the 4 days of feeding, all in the level voice of a man who had decided long ago that he'd done what any captain would have to do. The judge handling it, Baron Huddleston, had clearly already decided how he wanted it to come out, and he steered the jury into giving what's called a special verdict, where the jury simply states the facts and leaves the legal question to a higher panel of judges. He more or less wrote the verdict for them and had them adopt it, which was an unusual and somewhat heavy-handed way to run a trial, but it served his purpose of getting the legal question up to the highest judges in clean form. The facts as stated were brutal and plain, that the men were starving, that Parker would probably have died anyway, that without eating him they would all most likely have died, and that there was no greater necessity to kill Parker than any of the others, except that he was the weakest and closest to death already. The question then went up to a panel of 5 judges led by the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Coleridge. And Coleridge's ruling, handed down in December 1884, is one of the foundation stones of English criminal law to this day. The court held that necessity is not a defense to murder, that however desperate the circumstances, the law cannot grant one person the right to kill an innocent other to save themselves, because the moment you allow that, you have to start deciding whose life is worth more than whose, and who's to say the weakest, or the youngest, or the poorest, is the one who should die. Coleridge pointed out the obvious danger, that letting necessity excuse the killing would make the strongest, or the most ruthless, the judge of who lives. He wrote a line that law students still read more than a century later, the gist of it being that we are often compelled to set up standards we cannot ourselves reach, and to lay down rules we ourselves could not keep. It was a way of admitting the unbearable thing in the open, that he and his fellow judges, sitting safe and fed in a courtroom in England, might well have done exactly what Dudley and Stevens did had they been in that boat. That admission, he said, did not make it lawful. The law had to hold the line even against men it could not honestly claim it would have bettered. He sentenced Dudley and Stevens to death. The death sentence was a formality, and everyone in the room understood that. There was enormous public sympathy for the 2 men, the sailing communities were furious, and the government had no real intention of hanging 2 starving shipwreck survivors for following a custom every sailor in Britain already understood. The whole prosecution had been about establishing the principle, not about killing these particular men. Queen Victoria, on Harcourt's advice, commuted the sentence. The men served 6 months in prison, not really for the killing itself, but to mark once and for all that the custom of the sea carried no weight in an English court. They walked out in the spring of 1885, free men, their names now permanently fixed to a case that every law student in the English-speaking world would study forever. 2 ordinary sailors turned into a permanent lesson about the limits of necessity. R.V. Dudley and Stevens is still cited today, still argued over, still taught, the boy in the bottom of the boat, now a footnote in the education of every barrister. Tom Dudley couldn't settle after it. He never accepted that he'd done wrong, and the notoriety followed him everywhere in England. He was a marked man, the captain who'd killed and eaten the cabin boy, recognized in the street. So he emigrated to Australia, to Sydney, the very city the Mignonette had been bound for in the first place, as if to finish in spirit the voyage that had destroyed him. He set up a business there outfitting ships. And in one of those endings that feels almost too neat to be real but absolutely is, Dudley died in 1900 of bubonic plague, the first person to die in Sydney's plague outbreak that year. He'd handled something contaminated, the rats around his premises by one account, and the disease took him fast and hard. The health authorities, terrified of contagion, buried him sealed against the infection, his body wrapped and handled at arm's length, treated as something dangerous to touch. The man who'd survived an open boat by the most extreme means imaginable went out as patient zero in an epidemic, his corpse a thing the living were afraid to come near. Stevens, the mate, reportedly never recovered from any of it. The accounts that survive describe him drinking heavily for the rest of his life, a man hollowed out by what he'd done and seen, and dying years later much diminished. Brooks, the able seaman who hadn't been charged and had turned witness, apparently took the opposite route and made a small, grim living out of his survival, telling the story of the boat at fairs and shows for the price of admission. 3 men who'd sat in the same 13 feet of wood and come back carrying the same memory, and 3 completely different ways of trying to live with it: flight, drink, and performance. And there's a detail about Richard Parker, the boy, that I have to give you, because it's the kind of thing that makes the hair stand up on your arms. 46 years before the real Richard Parker died in that dinghy, Edgar Allan Poe wrote a novel, his only complete novel, called The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. In it, a group of shipwrecked sailors drift starving in an open boat and draw lots to decide who will be killed and eaten so the others can survive. The young sailor who draws the fatal lot, who is then stabbed and eaten by his companions, is named Richard Parker. Poe invented that name for a work of fiction in 1838. In 1884, the sea produced a real cabin boy of the very same name and handed him the very same death, lots and knife and all. Nobody has ever explained it as anything other than one of those coincidences the universe occasionally drops in your lap, just to remind you that it has a sense of humor and that the humor is not a kind one. The novelist Jan Martel was so struck by it that decades later he gave the name Richard Parker to the tiger in Life of Pi, which is itself a story of a boy and a predator surviving together in a lifeboat. Let me move off the water for a while, because the sea was only one place the Victorians met this horror, and the next one is, in some ways, even harder to sit with, because it happened to men who were supposed to be the absolute pride of the most powerful nation on earth. Not poor sailors on a leisure yacht, but the Royal Navy itself, at the height of its confidence, sailing out under flags and cheering crowds. They went looking for glory in the ice. What the ice did to them took more than a century to fully understand, and parts of it we only nailed down in the last few years. In May of 1845, 2 ships left England under the command of Sir John Franklin, a celebrated naval officer and Arctic explorer. The ships were HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, names that sound invented for a horror story and were not. Aboard them were 129 men, all volunteers, the best equipped polar expedition Britain had ever sent out. Their mission was to find the Northwest Passage, the sea route across the top of North America that everyone was convinced existed and that the British Empire desperately wanted to claim. These ships had reinforced hulls, steam heating, libraries of over 1,000 books each, and tinned food meant to last for years. They sailed into the Arctic with every advantage money and pride could buy. Franklin himself was an odd choice in some ways. He was nearly 60, past the age you'd want for a brutal polar command, and he carried the nickname, not entirely kindly, of the man who ate his boots, a reference to an earlier overland Arctic expedition of his that had gone so badly wrong that the survivors really had been reduced to eating their leather footwear and a kind of lichen scraped off rocks, and on which men had died, and there were even murmurs, never proven, of cannibalism among his party. So Franklin had already brushed up against the far edge of Arctic starvation once and survived it. That earlier brush makes the ending of his last expedition land even harder. He'd been to the threshold of this particular horror before. The second time, it took him and every man with him, and then they vanished, completely. A whaling ship saw the Erebus and Terror in late July of 1845, moored to an iceberg in Baffin Bay, the crews healthy and confident, waiting for a gap in the ice to push west. After that, for the men of the expedition, there is silence. Not one of the 129 came home. It became the greatest disaster in the history of British exploration, and for years nobody had the faintest idea what had happened to them. Ships were sent to look, rewards were offered. Lady Franklin, the commander's wife, pushed and campaigned and funded search after search. The Arctic simply swallowed them and gave the answers back only slowly, in pieces, over the next century and a half. What we've pieced together since, partly from the Inuit who lived in that country, partly from objects and bones found scattered across King William Island over the following century and a half, is a slow descent into something out of a nightmare. The ships got trapped in the ice off King William Island and never got free. They were locked in for at least a year and a half, maybe more. Franklin himself died in June of 1847. We know that much from a single note found in a cairn, the only written record the expedition left behind. The men held on through that and probably a second winter, and then, with the ships still frozen fast and the food running out and disease moving through them, the survivors did the only thing left to do. In April of 1848, around 105 men still living abandoned the ships and set out on foot, dragging boats on sledges across the ice, trying to walk to safety across hundreds of miles of the most hostile terrain on the planet. That note in the cairn, by the way, is one of the eeriest documents in the history of exploration. It was a standard naval form, filled in twice. The first time, in 1847, an officer wrote a cheerful note around the margins. All well, expedition proceeding. A year later, someone came back to the same piece of paper and scrawled an update around the edges in a different hand. Franklin dead. 24 men already dead. The ships abandoned, the survivors heading south for the mainland. The same scrap of paper holding both the confidence and the catastrophe a year apart. It's the last thing any of them wrote that we'll ever read. There's a grim physical backdrop to all of this that researchers have argued over for decades. and it deepens the horror rather than explaining it away. The men were almost certainly being poisoned by their own supplies. The tinned food, cutting-edge technology at the time, was sealed with lead solder, sloppily applied, and lead leached into the food. The ship's own water systems may have added more. High lead levels do terrible things. They cause confusion, weakness, erratic judgment, physical decline, and several studies of the bones and hair of the dead found lead loads consistent with serious poisoning, though scholars still debate how decisive it was. On top of that was scurvy, the vitamin C deficiency that haunted long voyages, which makes old wounds reopen, gums rot and bleed, and the body fall apart by degrees. So these were not men at full strength making clear choices. They were sick, possibly poisoned, scorbutic, frostbitten and starving, dragging heavy boats across the ice on the worst judgment their damaged bodies could muster. None of them made it. They died strung out along the coast and the inland routes, one after another, in their tracks. And it's how they died, and what some of them did to stay alive a little longer, that turned this from a tragedy into a scandal that tore at Victorian society. The first real news came in 1854 from a Scottish doctor and explorer named John Ray, who was surveying the area for the Hudson's Bay Company. Ray was unusual among British explorers in that he actually respected the Inuit, learned from them, travelled light the way they did instead of dragging the whole apparatus of empire across the ice. He could live off the land the way the local people did, build a snow house, hunt, cover enormous distances on foot. And because he travelled among them and spoke with them as people rather than as obstacles, the Inuit told him things. They told him that years earlier, a large group of white men had been seen dragging boats south, starving, dropping dead as they went. They described the men growing thinner, falling behind, dying along the way. And they told him something else, which Ray, to his credit and his lasting cost, reported honestly back to the Admiralty. The Inuit had found the bodies, and from the state of those bodies, from the cut marks, from the way the remains had been arranged, from contents found in a cooking kettle, it was clear that the last survivors had been eating the dead. The detail about the kettle is the one that stayed with people. The Inuit described finding human bones near the cooking gear, and flesh that had clearly been prepared, and limbs that had been cut. One account spoke of long boots that still held cooked human meat. Another described a body with the flesh cut cleanly away as if someone had been carving it. These were specific, sober observations from people who had actually walked the ground and seen what was there, and they would all, eventually, be confirmed. But that was decades off. Ray used a careful phrase in his report. He wrote that the men had been driven to the last resource, meaning cannibalism, to prolong their lives. He didn't sensationalize it. He simply reported what the Inuit had told him and what the physical evidence showed, and he bought relics from them, forks and spoons engraved with the officers' initials, bits of the expedition, to confirm the link beyond doubt. And he made one tactical mistake, which was assuming that the British public could handle the truth. The report leaked to the press, and the reaction was volcanic. The idea that British naval officers, gentlemen, Christians, representatives of the most advanced civilization in the world, had reduced themselves to eating each other's flesh. It was unthinkable. It was an insult to the Navy, to the Empire, to England itself. The newspapers were full of it. Families of the lost men were horrified to see their fathers and sons spoken of this way. And leading the charge against Ray was none other than Charles Dickens, the most famous writer in the country, a man at the absolute height of his fame and influence, took it upon himself to defend the honor of the dead in the pages of his own weekly magazine, Household Words, in 2 long articles in late 1854. Dickens's argument, when you read it now, is a genuinely ugly piece of work. And I say that as someone who loves a great deal of what the man wrote. He could not attack the physical evidence directly. He hadn't been there, and neither had anyone in England. So he attacked the witnesses. He argued that the testimony of the Inuit was essentially worthless because they were savages, and the word of savages could not be trusted against the honor of English gentlemen. He went further and suggested that the noble English sailors had most likely been murdered by these same Inuit, who had then invented the cannibalism story to cover their own crime. He wrote that he believed every savage to be in his heart covetous, treacherous, and cruel. He dismissed the careful, specific Inuit accounts as the vague babble of an inferior people who could not be relied upon. The whole performance came down to one immovable conviction, that an Englishman, a Christian, a Royal Navy officer, simply could not do this thing, and that anyone who said otherwise was either lying or too primitive to understand what he'd seen. Rather than believe his countrymen capable of it, Dickens was willing to brand an entire people as murderers and liars on no evidence at all. He was wrong, completely, provably wrong, and it took well over a century to prove it. But the proof is now overwhelming, and it's grim enough that I want to walk you through how we actually know. Starting in the 1980s, a Canadian anthropologist named Owen Beattie began going out to King William Island and the surrounding area to examine the physical remains of the expedition, the bones that had lain scattered across the tundra for over 130 years. Beattie is also the man who exhumed 3 crew members buried in the permafrost on Beechey Island, men who died early in the expedition and been buried properly, and whose faces were so perfectly preserved by the cold that the photographs of them, eyes half open, are some of the most unsettling images you'll ever see. Those frozen men were where the lead poisoning evidence first came from, but the bones scattered across the land told a different and darker part of the story. On a femur, a thigh bone, Beattie found cut marks, fine parallel scratches made by a metal blade, exactly where you'd cut to separate flesh from bone. Not the gnawing of animals, not random weathering, not the scrapes of being dragged across rock. Knife marks, deliberate, placed precisely where a person would cut if they were butchering a body for meat. Then in the 1990s, an anthropologist named Anne Keenlyside led a far more thorough study of a site on the island where the remains of at least 11 men had been found together. Nearly 400 bones and bone fragments, and on roughly a quarter of them, there were cut marks. The pattern told a precise and horrible story. The marks clustered around the joints, at the elbows and knees and shoulders, where you'd cut to take a limb apart at the joint, and they ran along the shafts of the long bones where the big muscles attach, where you'd cut to strip the meat off. This was not the chaos of a frenzy or the random damage of the elements. This was methodical defleshing, the systematic reduction of a human body to its usable parts, done by people who understood or were very quickly learning exactly how to do it. Keenlyside's conclusion was plain. The marks supported the 19th century Inuit accounts of cannibalism. The thing Dickens had called a savage lie was written into the bones in the marks of English knives. And then the last piece, the one that closes the case completely, came from a later study by Simon Mays and Owen Beattie. They went back to the bones, looked hard at the broken ends of the long bones in particular, and found two things sitting together. First, the bones had been deliberately broken open, snapped, fractured, to get at the marrow inside, the marrow being the last and richest source of fat and nourishment left in a body that has already been stripped of all its flesh. You don't break a bone like that by accident. You break it to eat what's inside. And second, on the broken ends they found something with a very specific name and a very specific cause: pot polishing. When bones are put into a pot of boiling water and stirred or knocked against the pot's sides over time as they cook, the broken edges get rubbed smooth and take on a faint polish. There is no natural process that produces it. It comes from cooking. The bones of the Franklin crew had been broken open for the marrow and then boiled in a pot. That is the final stage of starvation cannibalism, the stage you reach only when the flesh is gone and the truly desperate begin boiling the bones themselves to render every last trace of fat and nutrition out of them. The Inuit had described precisely this in 1854. Bones broken up for the marrow, human remains in a kettle. Point by point, detail by detail, the people Dickens dismissed had been telling the exact truth, and the proof was waiting in the ground the whole time. Sit with the full picture of it for a second. Men of the Royal Navy, the most disciplined institution of the age, dressed in the rags of their uniforms, hauling boats they no longer had the strength to haul, dying in a line across the ice. And the ones still living, faces frostbitten, gums bleeding from scurvy, possibly half poisoned by the lead in their own tinned food and their own water system, sitting over a small fire, breaking open the leg bones of the men they'd served alongside for 3 years, and boiling them. Some researchers believe the last few were carrying body parts with them as they walked. A portable food supply, butchered meat from their friends wrapped and dragged along on the sledges, because there was nothing else and no hope of anything else. John Ray was right the whole time, and it cost him nearly everything that should have been his. He was never given the knighthood his discoveries plainly deserved, never properly credited in his lifetime for essentially solving the Franklin mystery and, almost incidentally, for locating the final navigable link of the very Northwest Passage the whole disaster had been chasing. The establishment closed ranks around the comfortable lie and quietly pushed the honest man out to the margins of the story, his great crime being that he'd told the truth about what hunger does to people and had refused to dress it up to spare the Navy's feelings. Lady Franklin, the lost commander's widow, spent years and a considerable fortune promoting the heroic, sanitized version of her husband's expedition, commissioning memorials and monuments, working tirelessly to keep the word cannibalism away from his name and his men. For about 100 years, her version won. Ray died respected in some circles, but denied the recognition he'd earned, a footnote where he should have been a hero. The bones, when they finally gave up their evidence, vindicated him completely. Too late for him to ever know it. He'd been in his grave a long time before science proved that the man everyone had wanted to disbelieve had simply been telling them the truth all along. Let me bring you back toward home, and toward something that genuinely shocks people more than the shipwrecks do, I think, because the shipwreck cannibalism at least came from the far edge of desperation, from men who'd run out of every other option. We covered this in our previous video about cannibalism in the Middle Ages, and it's worth mentioning it here too. What I'm about to tell you came from the chemist's shop. It was legal, ordinary, and prescribed by physicians. People bought it across a counter the way you'd buy a cough remedy today. For a very long stretch of European history, running right up to and into the Victorian period, people ate human remains as medicine. Openly, on the advice of respectable doctors, sold in apothecary shops alongside the ordinary herbs and tinctures, prescribed for everyday complaints. A historian named Richard Sugg has done the deep work on this, gone through the old medical texts and the apothecary records, and the picture he assembles is one most people simply refuse to believe when they first hear it, because it sits so badly next to the image we carry of powdered wigs and politeness and progress. The same civilization that gave us the museum and the railway timetable was, within living memory of the Victorians, grinding up human beings and selling them as cures. The big one was something called mummia, or mummy. Originally, the word referred to a particular black, tarry, bitumen-like substance that seeped from certain rocks and was used in medicine. But somewhere along the way, through a tangle of mistranslation and wishful thinking, Europeans got the idea that the dark, resinous material inside preserved Egyptian mummies was the same potent stuff, and then that the whole mummy, flesh and all, carried the healing power. So they began importing actual mummies. Preserved human corpses, thousands of years old, dug out of Egyptian tombs, shipped to Europe, ground into powder, and sold across the apothecary counter as a remedy. You took mummy for bruising, for internal bleeding, for epilepsy, for general weakness and wasting. The famous French royal surgeon Ambroise Paré complained that mummy was practically the first and last medicine every physician of his day reached for against a bruise, even as he himself doubted it did the slightest good. James I of England reportedly refused to touch the stuff. But plenty of people of every rank paid real money for powdered ancient dead Egyptians and stirred the dust into their wine and their broth and drank it down for their health. When the supply of genuine old mummies ran short and the demand stayed high, an obvious and horrible solution presented itself to certain traders. They began faking it. They took fresh corpses, the bodies of executed criminals, of the very poor, of people dead from disease, of slaves, dried and treated and darkened them to pass as ancient, and sold those as Egyptian mummy. So, a respectable man dosing himself for a sore chest might well be swallowing the powdered remains of a beggar who'd died in the gutter the previous month, or a hanged thief dressed up and sold to him as a pharaoh 3,000 years old. There was, as you'd expect, no inspector checking. The whole trade ran on the buyer's faith that the brown powder in the jar was what the label claimed, and a good deal of it was not. And mummy was just the beginning of it. Human fat was rendered down and sold, used in salves rubbed onto the skin for pain, for cramps, for arthritis. Executioners in parts of Europe ran a brisk side business selling the fat of the criminals they'd just dispatched, because the body of a hanged man was considered medically potent. Human blood was drunk, fresh and warm when possible, as a treatment for epilepsy. At public executions in some parts of Europe, and this continued well into the 19th century, you'd find epileptics standing at the foot of the scaffold holding cups, waiting to catch the blood of the beheaded the instant the axe came down, then drinking it on the spot while it was still hot. Powdered human skull was prescribed for ailments of the head and for bleeding. Moss that grew on the skulls of the unburied dead, particularly skulls left out on battlefields or in the open, was scraped off and sold as a cure, the idea being that something so close to death and the human body must hold real power. The logic underneath all of it, as much as there was logic, ran something like this. The human body held a kind of vital force, a spirit or essence, and a body that had died suddenly and violently, an executed criminal, a young soldier killed in battle, was thought to hold the most of it, because that life had been cut off at its full strength rather than ebbing away through illness or age. So the freshest, most potent corpse medicine came from the gallows and the battlefield, from the bodies of the young and the violently killed. That belief drove a genuine trade. The blood of the executed was so prized that there were men whose actual job was to stand by the scaffold, catch the blood, and sell it. In some German towns, the connection between the executioner and the apothecary's shelf was so well established that the hangman was, in effect, a supplier of medical ingredients. There's something deeply strange in picturing a respectable burgher with a headache reaching for a remedy whose key ingredient came warm from a beheading he might have attended himself. Now the medical use of this stuff was fading by Victoria's reign, pushed out slowly by actual science and changing tastes. But it faded unevenly, and among the poor and in the folk medicine of the countryside, it lingered well into the 19th century. Sugg makes the point that corpse medicine didn't end at some clean, well-lit cut-off date, where the old superstitions stopped and the modern world began. It hung on stubbornly into the time of Queen Victoria, in the gaps and shadows where proper medicine hadn't yet reached, in country remedies and old wives' cures and the practices of people too poor for a real doctor. A Victorian child might still have a grandmother who swore by something with a human ingredient in it. The line between the age of corpse medicine and the age of the modern hospital is much blurrier and much more recent than anyone is comfortable admitting. And there's one strand of this that outlived all the others, and it's so strange I almost don't blame people for refusing to believe it. Ground-up mummies were also used to make paint. A pigment existed, a rich, warm brown, made by grinding up Egyptian mummies. The flesh, the linen wrappings, the embalming resins all together. And it was sold to artists under the name Mummy Brown. Painters prized it for the warm, transparent depth it gave to shadows, to skin tones, to the dark, glowing areas in the corners of a canvas. It went onto the palettes of some of the most respected painters of the 19th century, including some of the big names of the age, very possibly without all of them fully registering what was in the tube, that they were spreading the ground-up remains of ancient human beings across their masterpieces, that the shadow on a painted cheek was made of a person who had been mummified 3,000 years ago and shipped to Europe to be turned into art supplies. There's a story, possibly polished in the retelling but rooted in something real, of the painter Edward Burne-Jones learning for the first time what mummy brown actually was, that it was made from real mummies, real human remains, and being so appalled that he took the tube of paint out into his garden and gave it a proper burial in the ground, then and there, to put the person back to rest. Whether it happened exactly that way or not, it captures the moment of realization that a lot of Victorian artists must have had. The dawning understanding that the lovely brown they'd been painting with all these years was somebody. The pigment stayed in production absurdly late. A London colour-making firm was still producing mummy brown from actual mummies well into the 20th century, and the way it finally ended is almost too fitting. The story goes that they simply ran out. They had used up their last mummy, ground the last preserved Egyptian into the last batch of paint, and there were no more to be had. And so the colour quietly went out of production, not on moral grounds, but for want of bodies. One of the firm's managers reportedly remarked that they might have a few odd limbs lying about still, but that they'd sold their last whole mummy years before. So there are portraits hanging in galleries right now, looked at every day by people who have no idea, where the shadows on a face are quite literally made of someone's distant ancestor painted into permanence. While British sailors were eating each other in lifeboats, and British explorers were boiling their friends' bones in the Arctic, the Victorian public was utterly obsessed with the idea of cannibals in faraway places. The savage cannibal of the tropics was one of the great fixtures of the Victorian imagination. In the adventure novels boys devoured by the thousand, in the missionary lectures that packed church halls, in the illustrated papers with their lurid engravings of dark-skinned figures dancing around cooking pots with a white explorer trussed up inside. It was entertainment and reassurance rolled together. The cannibal lived safely far away, over the horizon, in the parts of the map the Empire was busy colouring in, and he made the people back home feel civilized by contrast. The truth underneath all that obsession is tangled, because some of it was real, a great deal of it was wildly exaggerated, and the exaggeration nearly always seemed to serve the same purpose, which was to justify what the Empire was already doing to the people it described. Fiji is the place where the documented reality is hardest to wave away. The islands had a genuine, deeply rooted practice of ritual cannibalism well established long before any European arrived, and it was bound up with warfare and religion in ways that the missionaries who witnessed it described in detail. Defeated enemies, captured warriors, sometimes shipwrecked sailors who washed up at the wrong place were killed, clubbed usually, or had their skulls smashed, and then cooked in earth ovens and eaten as part of religious and political ritual. The victims were called bokola. The chiefs and priests who ate the flesh were considered too sacred to let it touch their hands or their lips directly, so they used special long-pronged wooden forks made for exactly this purpose. Those forks survive in museums today, labeled plainly as cannibal forks, and there are a lot of them, which by itself tells you this wasn't a rare aberration. The practice was woven into nearly every important moment of Fijian public life in some regions. The launching of a new war canoe might be marked by it, bodies placed on the rollers, so the canoe was dragged down to the sea over them. The building of a temple, the death of a chief, a victory in battle, all could call for it. Captured enemies were sometimes kept alive and made to suffer first, and the missionary accounts describe things done to living victims that I'm not going to spell out in full, except to say that the cruelty was deliberate and ritualized rather than frenzied. Particular body parts were considered delicacies and reserved for the highest-ranking men. The cooking was done in the earth ovens the islanders used for pigs and other meat, wrapped in leaves buried with hot stones. To the people doing it, this was not a horror. It was the proper order of things, the way power and religion and revenge were expressed, and it had been for a very long time. The missionary accounts get specific in ways that are hard to read. A Methodist missionary named Thomas Williams, who lived in Fiji in the 1840s and wrote a detailed book about it, described bodies being prepared, described victims sometimes being kept alive and made to watch their own cooking fires being lit, described the ovens, the rituals, the casual, everyday quality of it among people for whom this was simply part of how the world worked. Whether every lurid detail in the missionary accounts is exactly accurate is a fair question. These were men with a strong motive to portray the islanders as deeply in need of saving. But the core of it, the reality of ritual cannibalism in Fiji, is not in serious doubt. The archaeology backs it up. Butchered human bones turn up in the islands going back many centuries, marked the same way you'd mark an animal carcass for the pot. The forks back it up. Too many independent witnesses back it up. The most famous Fijian story to reach Victorian Britain involved one of those missionaries directly. A man named Thomas Baker, a Methodist, went up into the mountainous interior of the main island, Viti Levu, in 1867, into highland villages where Christianity hadn't reached and the old ways were intact. He'd been working in Fiji for years by then, on the coast where the mission had a foothold, and he wanted to push inland, to bring the gospel to the hill tribes who had never accepted it. The coastal Christians warned him. The interior was dangerous, the highland chiefs were not friendly to outsiders, and the old customs there were absolutely alive. Baker went anyway, with a party of Fijian Christian converts and helpers travelling alongside him. And there, in the hills, Baker and most of the men with him were killed and eaten. He's the only European missionary known to have been eaten in Fiji, and the story that came down, which may be true, may be embroidered, is that he gave fatal offence by touching the head of a chief or by reaching into a chief's hair for something, perhaps a comb that the chief had taken. In Fijian custom, the head of a chief was intensely sacred, the most untouchable part of the most untouchable person, and to lay a hand on it was a violation grave enough to demand death. Another version holds that a rival coastal chief had quietly sent word ahead that Baker should be killed for political reasons of his own, and that the head touching was the pretext rather than the true cause. Whatever the exact trigger, Baker was clubbed, and then he and his companions were butchered, cooked in the earth ovens, and eaten. The one or two of his Fijian followers who escaped carried the story back down to the coast. The detail that has fixed itself in the retellings is about his boots. The Highlanders, the story goes, tried to cook and eat his leather boots along with the rest of him and couldn't manage it. The boiled leather defeated them. The partly cooked soles ended up kept, and they survive in the Fiji Museum in Suva to this day, sitting in a case, a pair of ruined Victorian shoe soles that are, when you think about what they are, one of the more haunting objects in any museum anywhere. More than a century later, in 2003, the descendants of the village that killed him held a formal ceremony of reconciliation and apology to Baker's descendants, who came out from England and Australia for it. The people of the village had come to believe, over the generations, that they'd been cursed ever since, that nothing had gone right for them since the day they ate the missionary, and the ceremony was partly an attempt to lift that. Whether you believe in the curse or not, the fact that an apology was made and accepted 136 years after the killing tells you the event never really left that place. And then there's a figure who appears in the record as almost a legend, a Fijian chief named Ratu Udre Udre from the northern part of the main island, around Rakiraki. According to a missionary who was in Fiji in the 1840s and recorded the account, Udre Udre kept a personal tally of every human being he had ever eaten, and he kept it by setting aside a single stone for each one. He laid those stones up in a line near where he was to be buried, a running count in stone of his lifetime's consumption. When they were tallied after his death, the number came to around 872, and by some tellings, with stones lost or added, closer to 1,000. 872 human beings eaten by one man across one lifetime. The account says he preferred to eat alone, that he kept the preserved flesh to himself and shared it with no one, that for him it was a matter of personal power and appetite rather than communal ritual. His son reportedly confirmed the figure, saying yes, his father had eaten all of those people. Now, this comes down through oral tradition and a single missionary's report. So the precise number is something to hold loosely. It may be close to exact, it may have grown in the retelling the way numbers do. But the practice it describes, a powerful chief consuming the bodies of his defeated enemies one after another across decades as a mark of dominance, keeping a literal count of the dead, fits everything else we know about how the thing worked in that place. Udre Udre holds, for whatever a record like that is worth, the title of the most prolific cannibal in all of recorded human history, his name fixed forever to a line of stones counting bodies. The Congo is where this gets murkier and where the Victorians' appetite for cannibal stories did real harm, because the line between reporting and propaganda dissolved almost completely. The great explorer Henry Morton Stanley, the Dr. Livingstone, I presume man, filled his hugely popular books with accounts of cannibal tribes lining the rivers, of warriors screaming meat, meat from the banks as his boats passed, of constant peril and savagery around every bend. The books sold enormously. And Stanley, we now know, exaggerated relentlessly. His most careful modern biographer went back through the records and found that Stanley inflated the size of the caravans he led, inflated the number of attacks, inflated the death tolls, inflated the savagery of the people he met. Because danger and savagery sold books and, more importantly, justified the thing he was actually doing, which was helping to carve out one of the most brutal colonial regimes in history in the Congo on behalf of the King of the Belgians. The arithmetic of it was simple and ugly. The more cannibals and savages there seemed to be in the popular imagination, the more reasonable, even noble, it looked for Europeans to march in with guns and impose what they called order. The cannibal on the riverbank was useful. He justified everything that followed. And what followed, the forced labor rubber regime that killed people in the Congo on a staggering scale, was carried out by the same Europeans who'd been telling everyone back home how savage the locals were. So you have to hold two things at once when you read these accounts, and it's genuinely difficult. Some of the cannibalism in the region was real, warfare and ritual practice that colonial and local sources both attest to. And a great deal of what reached Victorian readers was invented or wildly inflated for profit and for the convenience of empire, by men who had every reason to make the people they were conquering sound like monsters. The honest position, the one careful historians take, is that the truth sat somewhere in the tangle, and that the loudest, most lurid accounts are exactly the ones to trust least. That said, the Congo did witness real horror connected to cannibalism, and one episode in particular sticks in the throat. In 1888, on an expedition Stanley had organized to relieve a stranded governor deep in the African interior, a wealthy Irishman named James Jameson, heir to the whiskey fortune, traveling as the expedition's naturalist, became curious about whether the stories of cannibalism were true. By the most credible account, an affidavit later sworn by the expedition's interpreter, Jameson made a comment that he'd like to actually see it, that he didn't believe the tales, and was challenged to put up the means. He was told that if he wanted to see it done, he could buy a victim. He bought a young enslaved girl around 10 years old for the price of 6 handkerchiefs, specifically so that he could watch her be killed and eaten. The girl was led to a spot, handed over, stabbed twice, and then butchered while she was dying or just dead. And Jameson, an educated Victorian gentleman with a sketchbook, sat and drew the whole thing, the men cutting the body apart, carrying off the pieces, in a series of pencil sketches that he later worked up into finished watercolors. 6 drawings, by the interpreter's account, one for each stage of it, the way a naturalist might document the dissection of a specimen he'd collected. A child, bought for a handful of cloth, killed for the curiosity of a man who could have spent that day doing anything else at all, and the man's response was to reach for his pencils. When this came out, Jameson was already dead. He'd died of fever in Africa not long after, so he never had to answer for it in person. His family and defenders fought hard for his reputation. They said he'd never meant for it to happen, that he'd made an idle remark and was horrified when the Africans took him at his word and actually did it, that he tried to stop it once it was underway. His own diary, published after his death, admits he sent for the handkerchiefs after being challenged, but claims he thought the whole thing was a joke and was sickened by what followed. The interpreter who swore the original affidavit later softened parts of his account under pressure from Jameson's allies. So the exact degree of Jameson's intent, whether he coldly arranged a murder for entertainment or stumbled into one through grotesque carelessness, is genuinely contested, and I won't pretend it's settled. But the core event is supported by enough testimony that serious historians accept it happened. A girl bought, killed, and eaten, while a European man sat and sketched. It's the kind of detail that burns off any romance the era might still hold for you. A man with the wealth and education to be anything he wanted, treating a child's death as material for his art. I want to close out the journey on dry land with a couple of cases that sit at the edge of all this, because they show how the cannibalism story haunted the 19th century imagination, even in places far from any shipwreck or jungle. Over in the American West, in the winter of 1874, a prospector named Alfred Packer led 5 other men into the San Juan Mountains of Colorado, into deep snow and brutal cold, chasing the dream of gold. The party had been warned not to go. The local Ute people told them the mountains in deep winter were a death sentence, that they should wait for spring. And they went anyway, a group of inexperienced men walking into some of the most punishing high country in North America at the worst possible time of year. Months later, Packer came out alone. He turned up at an outpost looking, by some accounts, suspiciously well fed for a man who'd supposedly been starving in the mountains all winter, and with money and belongings that had clearly belonged to his companions. His story kept changing. First he'd been abandoned by the others, then he'd gotten lost and wandered alone. Then, when a search eventually found the bodies lying together in a clearing, the truth became impossible to dodge. The 5 men were found in one spot, most of them with their skulls crushed and their bodies stripped of flesh, strips cut away from the chest and thighs, the meat a starving man would go for first. Packer eventually admitted that the party had become trapped by snow and starvation, that the men had died or been killed one by one, and that he had survived by eating them. He claimed he'd killed only one man, named Bell, and only in self-defense, after Bell had gone mad with hunger, murdered the others while Packer was away gathering wood, and come at him with a hatchet. The crushed skulls, all of them, not just one, made the self-defense story hard to swallow whole, and the suspicion has always been that Packer killed the men for their provisions and their flesh, rather than purely to survive what nature had done. He was arrested, escaped, stayed on the run for 9 years under a false name, was recaptured, and finally tried in 1883. The first jury convicted him, and he was sentenced to hang, but the conviction was overturned on a legal technicality. He was retried in 1886, convicted this time of 5 counts of manslaughter, and sentenced to 40 years. He served until around the turn of the century, was paroled, and died in 1907. And here's a wrinkle that says something about the law and about us. Packer was never convicted of cannibalism because cannibalism was not actually a crime. He was convicted of killing the men. Eating them was, legally speaking, beside the point. There's a famous, almost certainly invented quote attributed to the sentencing judge, supposedly raging that there had been only so many Democrats in the whole county, and Packer had eaten most of them, which never happened in those words, and would have been wildly improper from the bench. But the fact that people wanted it to be true, that the joke attached itself to him and stuck for over a century, tells you how badly the public craved a folk villain version of the cannibal, something they could laugh at to keep the real horror at arm's length. And then, at the far edge of believability, there's the legend the Victorians and their predecessors loved best of all, the story of Sawney Bean. As it's told, Alexander Sawney Bean was the head of a clan that lived in a sea cave on the coast of Scotland. And over a span of 25 years, this family of 40-odd people, Bean, his wife, their many inbred children and grandchildren, ambushed travelers on the lonely roads, dragged them back to the cave, robbed them, killed them, and ate them. Over 1,000 victims, by the legend. They pickled and salted the leftover human flesh and hung it in the cave, and stray limbs supposedly washed up on nearby beaches now and then. The story ends with King James himself leading a small army with bloodhounds to the cave, discovering the hoard of pickled human remains, and executing the entire clan without trial. It's a tremendous story. It's also almost certainly not true. No contemporary record of any of it exists. No crisis of 1,000 missing travelers. No royal expedition with bloodhounds, nothing in the chronicles of the period when it supposedly happened, and a disappearance on that scale, 1,000 people vanishing off the roads of a region over 25 years, is not the sort of thing that leaves no trace at all in the written record of the time. The tale only surfaces in print much later, more than a century after the events it claims to describe, in cheap, sensational broadsheets and crime pamphlets sold to a public that loved a good horror. The name Sawney was a common English mocking nickname for a Scotsman, the way you'd use a slur to stand in for a whole people. Read in that light, the whole thing has the shape of anti-Scottish propaganda dressed up as true crime. A story the English told about the savage, inbred wild men supposedly lurking just over the northern border, refined and reprinted across generations into something deliciously frightening. People have gone looking, seriously, for any real Alexander Bean, any real cave, any real mass grave, and have come up with nothing solid. So I give it to you as what it is. A legend, a campfire story that grew teeth over the centuries, rather than as history. But the fact that it endured, that it was retold and reprinted and half-believed for 300 years, is itself a real piece of history, and it points back at everything else we've walked through tonight. The hunger for the cannibal in the dark, the family in the cave, the monster waiting on the lonely road to drag you off and eat you, ran extraordinarily deep through these centuries. And here's what stays with me once the legends are set aside. The cave full of pickled limbs, and the inbred clan of the wilderness sat at a safe distance, comfortably far away, comfortably invented, happening to somebody else somewhere else. The documented cases sat much closer to home and wore much more ordinary faces. A respectable yacht captain with a penknife. The pride of the Royal Navy boiling its own dead in a kettle on the ice, a tube of brown paint on a famous painter's palette, a tincture of skull a king swallowed as he died, an educated Irishman with a sketchbook in the Congo. Victorians lay awake imagining savages in distant lands with sharpened teeth. The record keeps handing back a different set of culprits, dressed in good coats and naval uniforms and the robes of respectable medicine, and that turns out to be the part nobody wanted to hear. There's one last thread I want to pull, because it sits right underneath all of this and explains, a little, why the Victorians were so haunted by the eating of human flesh. They had a deeply uneasy relationship with the dead body itself. A few years before Victoria came to the throne in Edinburgh, two Irishmen named William Burke and William Hare ran one of the most chilling murder operations in British history. The medical schools of Edinburgh were the best in the world, and they needed a steady supply of fresh corpses to teach anatomy on. And there were never anywhere near enough legal ones. Only the bodies of executed criminals could lawfully go to the dissecting table, and there weren't many of those. So a black market had grown up, the trade of the resurrection men, who dug up the freshly buried by night and sold them to the surgeons. Families of the recently dead would sit by the graves of their loved ones for weeks, in shifts, to stop the body snatchers getting at them. That's the world Burke and Hare were operating in. What they worked out was that you could skip the digging entirely. It started almost by accident. A lodger in Hare's boarding house died owing rent, and rather than lose the money, Hare and Burke sold the body to a respected anatomist named Robert Knox and were startled by how much he paid, no questions asked. From there it became a business. Over the course of about 10 months in 1828, they murdered 16 people. Their method was specific and quiet. They targeted the poor, the drunk, the sick, travelers, people who wouldn't be missed and wouldn't be looked for, lured them to the lodging house, got them insensible with drink, and then one of them would lie across the victim's chest while the other clamped a hand over the nose and mouth, smothering them in a way that left no marks of violence and kept the body fresh and undamaged, exactly what the anatomists wanted. The method was so associated with them afterward that to Burke entered the language as a word meaning to smother or suppress. They sold each fresh corpse to Dr. Knox for somewhere around £7 to £10, good money at the time, and Knox, who must have wondered why these two men kept bringing him such conveniently fresh and undamaged bodies, asked nothing. It came apart when other lodgers found a body hidden in the house before it could be sold. The authorities had a weak case, depending on which murders they could actually prove, so they made a deal. Hare turned on Burke, confessed, and testified against him in exchange for immunity, walking free for his trouble. Burke was convicted and hanged in front of a crowd that, by some estimates, topped 25,000 people, every one of them straining to see the man who'd turned murder into a supply chain. And then, in a piece of justice almost too fitting to be true, Burke's own body was handed to the anatomists. He was publicly dissected in front of a packed lecture theatre, the exact fate he had been selling other people into. And the surgeon doing it reportedly dipped a pen in Burke's blood and wrote a note with it. His skeleton was kept, and it is still on display in a medical museum in Edinburgh, where you can go and look at him today, the man who sold the dead, now permanently a specimen himself. There's even a small pocketbook said to be bound in his tanned skin. Hare, the one who walked free, vanished into rumour. Nobody knows for certain how or where he died. The scandal was so enormous, and the public fear of the resurrection men so intense, that it pushed Parliament to pass the Anatomy Act in 1832, the year before the Victorian era proper began. The Act gave the medical schools a legal supply of bodies at last, but it did so mainly by handing over the unclaimed bodies of the poor, the people who died in workhouses and public institutions with no family to claim them and no money for a funeral, which created its own quiet, lasting horror among the poor of Victorian Britain. The knowledge that if you died destitute and alone, the state could give your corpse to the anatomists to be cut apart, that poverty itself could deliver your body to the dissecting table. People who had nothing else still desperately wanted a proper burial, a whole body in the ground, and now even that could be taken from them by an act of law. That fear of your body being taken, opened, used, consumed by others after death, runs all the way through this period, and I think it's part of why the cannibalism stories gripped them as hard as they did. The eating of human flesh was simply the most extreme version of a dread they already carried, the dread that the body, which their church promised would one day rise again whole and incorruptible, might instead be broken down and used up by the living before it ever got the chance. And once you start looking for that pattern, the flesh being treated as a resource, it's in nearly every story we've touched tonight. In the lifeboats and on the ice, it was raw hunger that did the breaking down. In the apothecary shop, it was medicine and money. In the Edinburgh lodging house, it was murder for profit. In the painter's studio, it was art. Desperate men and respectable men alike kept arriving at the same place from different directions, the human body as a thing to be consumed, rendered, ground up, sold, eaten, and the 17-year-old lying in the bottom of a 13-foot boat off the coast of Africa is only the clearest and saddest example of where that road runs out. Tom Dudley, the captain who held the knife, kept until the end of his life a small notebook in which he'd recorded the daily ordeal in the boat, the dwindling rations, the weather, the turtle, the deaths, the dates. He never showed remorse for the act itself, only a quiet, lasting bitterness that the law had branded him a murderer for doing what the sea had always quietly permitted men to do. He went to his grave on the far side of the world believing he'd been wronged, not by the boy's death, but by England's refusal to understand it. And when the plague took him in Sydney, sealed in his grave, handled like something poisonous, the only people left alive who truly knew what he carried were two men on the other side of the planet, one of them drinking himself toward an early grave, the other telling the story for coins at a fairground. 3 men who had shared 13 feet of wood and a single unbearable decision, scattered now across the world, each carrying the same knowledge about how quickly the floor drops away when the water runs out and the food runs out, and no sail breaks the horizon. The boy, Richard Parker, has the simplest memorial of all of them. There's a family gravestone near Southampton that remembers him, and on it someone added a line of scripture about not avenging yourself, about leaving vengeance to God. He was 17. He'd wanted to see Sydney and prove himself a sailor. He got neither. What he got instead was a place in every law library in the English-speaking world. His name read out by people who will never know the first thing about him except the manner of his death, which the law decided, finally, was murder after all. That's where I'll leave it tonight. Thank you for sitting through a heavy one with me. I know this wasn't the easiest listen, and I appreciate you trusting me to walk you through it without turning it into a freak show. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the sort of person I make these for. Tell me in the comments where you listened from and what stuck with you, because the strange ones always seem to land differently for different people. If you want to help me keep digging into corners of history like this, there are links below to do that, but no pressure at all. Just being here is plenty. Take care of yourself out there. I'll have another one ready before long.